Well, good afternoon. I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I want to welcome you to this Dickey Center event entitled Giving Up the Higher Ground, Where Does the U.S. Go From Here? And I particularly want to thank everyone in the audience who thought that even on this dark and dreary November afternoon, much like the beginning of Moby Dick, that you decided to come here instead of doing what Ishmael did and shipping out. So I don't want to be overly judgmental about the matter, but I don't think there is a more pressing or more urgent question facing us today than the one in this title. And in the last 3 years, we've seen the United States abandon traditional values and policies, mistreat allies, traduce agreements, and largely abandon its role as global leader, while still sometimes throwing around its weight as though the world should naturally accede to our demands, regardless of what else we are doing elsewhere around the globe. So let me just mention a few proper nouns to frame that contention. Yemen, Syria, Ukraine, Putin, Erdogan, Mohammed bin Salman, the Paris Accords on climate, the Iran nuclear deal, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. Have you had enough? Well, I'm delighted that someone else is here to discuss this sad record, and in particular, I'm pleased that that person is Sarah Margon. Sarah spent 7 years, did you say, at Human Rights Watch? Wow. Where she was director of the Washington office, and Human Rights Watch, I'm sure you all know, is one of the really fabulous NGOs at work in the United States today, upholding what many of us thought were traditional American values. Just last month, she was appointed Director of Foreign Policy Advocacy at the Open Society Foundation. And for those who pay attention to these things, that means she is now either part of the most baleful left-wing conspiracy in history and part of the malevolent Soros empire, or, if you prefer my view, that means she's now well-placed to carry forward the terrific work that Open Society does as one of the clarion voices out there pressing for a progressive foreign policy. Earlier in her career, Sarah Margon was Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to Senator Russ Feingold of Wisconsin. I believe that's when we met, when you were looking at me skeptically when I met Senator Feingold prior to a confirmation hearing on Capitol Hill. I am guessing that she was looking skeptically at all the national security nominees who were passing her way, but I will leave it up to her to say that or not. She's also served as staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on African Affairs. She has skyrocketed up the list of favorite Dickey speakers without even coming up to the podium because she brought her own audience, which is a really remarkable thing here in Hanover, New Hampshire. I should add that Sarah has received a master's from Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service, as well as a bachelor's from Wesleyan in Connecticut, correct? And so we're really pleased that she has ventured north from Washington today. Sarah, the podium is yours.
Hi. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for taking me out of Washington, actually, is what I should say. Thanks to Dan Benjamin and the Dickey Center for hosting me, and thanks to Justin Anderson. I don't see where he is. Oh, there he is. But he's kind of the catalyst and the seed, and if you don't know, he was also the best man at my wedding. So I think I might be as close to a hometown girl as you can get coming up to Dartmouth. I'm not from Hanover, but I'm married to a native Hanoverite. Is that what we say? Hanoverian. So it's a real thrill to be on the other side. I've spent 20 years coming up to see my family here, 2 of which are in the audience, and many friends of the family and of my husband, Sam. But I'm also really excited to be here because I'm suddenly not Sam's wife or Leo and Isaac's mother. I am Sarah Margon, the professional, which those of you who know me in the audience have maybe heard about, but you don't actually know what it is, and nobody seems to know really what I do. And these days, I should be honest, I'm not entirely sure what I do given sort of the state of affairs in Washington. But I thought I'd talk a little bit about the Trump administration's foreign policy over the last 2 years. I'd put it in a little bit of global context, translate a little bit for those of you who don't watch every movement of either the US president or other global leaders, and then talk about what it means for the future, both for us here in the United States, for you here in Hanover, and then for the world. But the spoiler alert is that I don't have all the answers. I actually don't have really any answers. So if you're looking for that, you probably want to go somewhere else. But what I can do is give you a sense of things from my vantage point from watching policy, human rights, the rule of law, and bad and good governments over the last 20 years. So let's start with this state of the world. That seems like a pretty good place to start. In January 2017, when Trump became the 45th president, the state of the world was in a tough spot already. People were increasingly vulnerable. The international architecture like the United Nations and other entities that you have known and heard of since that the US helped create since the end of World War II were being tested. Populist, national forces, wars were making significant gains. We were starting to see a rollback in democratic countries like Hungary or the Philippines. Political rights, civil rights, press freedom, refugee and asylum seekers were all on the move. It often feels like the world is on fire, and in a lot of ways, I think it is on fire right now. I think we're in a pretty dramatic period globally, but it's important to remember that it isn't Trump that started this. According to Freedom House, in 2016, we saw the 11th year of consecutive decline in global freedom. Think about that for a second. That means we've been moving in this direction. So it's not all about Trump, but there's no question that Trump has made it worse. Some of the dynamics that are shifting would have shifted without Trump. Some of them are long-term global changes that are the natural outgrowth of the post-Soviet world. But here's some ways he's making it worse. No president has talked about human rights and the rule of law the way President Trump has. And I think it's important to put that in context because if you came of age, and there's not a ton of you in the room, but if you came of age after 9/11, meaning you were born around 9/11, you probably don't know the United States as a force for good. There's aspirational goals, there's rhetoric, there's language that we use. But if you're older, you've seen the US do good things. You understand how the interests and the values can meet. But if you travel overseas now, I find often that I sort of don't want to be American. I'm pretending not to be American. I'm embarrassed, not just by the actions of this administration, but even by some of the ones from the last administration, where interests and values were manipulated for national security interests. I'm thinking particularly of the Iraq War, but also the CIA torture program. Those weren't good things. The US was harmful. But if you look at where we are now, there's been even more dramatic change. Trump regularly praises, meets with, talks to, sees, and invites to the White House autocrats and dictators. North Korea's leader, Filipino President Duterte, who's running an extrajudicial anti-drug campaign that's killed over 12,000 people. Recently, at a G7 summit in France, he called Egypt's President Sisi his favorite dictator to the shock of many US government officials. He attacks the press, goes after individual journalists, goes after his own staff if he feels like he's being crossed, which he's doing all the time now in light of the impeachment inquiry. His administration has cut funds for women at home and abroad, meanwhile launching an economic empowerment program for women, which sounds really good. But if women don't have access to basic services to take care of their own bodies, how can they be empowered economically? He bullies, he's discriminatory, he's anti-Semitic, he's xenophobic. His aggressive anti-immigration measures have meant not just a shutdown at the border and separation of thousands of children from their parents, it also means the smallest number of asylum seekers and refugees being able to come to the United States since the program was started at the end of World War II. Last year, he manipulated the caravans coming up from Central America. He blamed them on George Soros and actually said George Soros was funding them and used them as a way to bait the other side, move his political base in an attempt to win the midterm elections. He's also tried to use the power of the presidency for personal gain, which is what Congress is looking into now. The ramifications of the impeachment inquiry are obviously going to have huge a huge impact here in the United States, but they're also going to have a global impact, because what we've seen, what I've been watching closely over the last almost 3 years, global leaders watch Trump. They follow Trump. They mimic him. They use his words. You've heard him talk about fake news all the time. I've seen that phrase used, and used as a way to defend negative or abusive actions in countries from Egypt to Burma to Syria and many others. So this is not to say that the US was perfect before, but the things he's doing now are not just rhetorically bad. It's not just that the gloves have come off, is that he's undermining the institutions that the US has that are supposed to be the checks and balances on the power of the presidency. So before we talk more about where we're going, I want to drill down a little bit on things that I see kind of hitting the way that Trump is engaging the world. I see 5 big challenges that in any other environment, the US would be engaging globally in a constructive way. The first is creeping authoritarianism. I mentioned a little bit populists and the rise of nationalists. So we're seeing this in many, many countries: Hungary, the Philippines, Brazil. I could go on as I watch these trends sort of manipulate, and I watch leaders cover up abuse by dodging scrutiny. They use a 2-step approach. The first, hatred, scapegoating, and intolerance. One side versus the other. You're in my favorite group. It's kind of a majoritarian push to undermine the others and enable this side to go after that side, choosing favorites almost, if you will. Then the next step, weaken the checks and balances of the rule of law, the free media, and civil society, so there is no space to push back on the government's approach. If you're really lucky, you also get to stack the judiciary with your kind of judges, and then you don't have to worry about an independent judicial system either. Second, weakening of the international framework and a shift to great power competition. This is a phrase that I have never heard more than I have in the last 18 months. I'm sure, Dan, you keep hearing about this too. From what I understand, great power competition, or GPC, is the newest acronym at the Pentagon that they're all worried about. It's no longer necessarily just a concern about terrorism. It's a concern about countries and governments going up against each other. China, what's the great power? Who's competing against who? But at the same time, you also have attacks on the very infrastructure that the US helped create after World War II. This is best defined by the United Nations. This is supposed to be the arbiter, the center of our great community, with treaties, with norms, with standards. The UN Security Council is supposed to manage peace and security issues. The Human Rights Council is supposed to address human rights issues. There's supposed to be special rapporteurs or envoys who engage. You're supposed to use diplomacy. The UN Security Council is stuck, mostly because of China, Russia, and the United States not being able to engage. The Human Rights Council, which has been reformed multiple times, is increasingly being overrun with bad actors from Venezuela to Saudi Arabia. Journalists are increasingly being attacked, and the UN is doing very little. When you think about what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, the exiled Saudi journalist that many of you have probably heard of, he walked into a consulate in Turkey, never to be heard from again. The UN conducted an initial investigation, came out with recommendations, and very clear indications that the Saudis were responsible for it. There's been no response. Despite the UN's good work, the lack of credibility that they have been able to use in pushing forward on actual accountability, to me, is a real indicator of just how weak some of these institutions are becoming. It also means, when you think about great power, we're less of a community. And that's why if you think of the UN kind of like the living room of the international community, we're less of a community and more of a place where you see competition. This means transnational issues like terrorism, disease, technological disasters, climate change, which require multiple governments to work together because they don't know borders, don't have a place to go. They don't have a forum. So we're all going to be tackling them separately, and meanwhile, nobody's going to be able to resolve anything. So what happens in a space like that? China and Russia step in. It shouldn't be very surprising. We're seeing it in multiple ways. When I was at Human Rights Watch, we did a report documenting China's way of infiltrating the United Nations. They did it in very careful, assiduous ways. They went to the Budget Committee, and they started to try to push the money away from human rights, the rule of law, monitors, documentation, and exposing of abuses. They tried to move language from accountability and responsibility to dialogue and cooperation. They tried to push the narrative of sovereignty above all, when in fact cooperation in the UN system is not supposed to be an excuse for not being held responsible. It's supposed to be a way for governments to work together to hold people accountable for abuse. At the same time, they are exporting surveillance. They are flouting regional tribunals on the South China Sea's decision. Russia is engaging on political interference in elections, as we know, not just here, but in many other countries. Without anyone or any collection of governments to stand up, they're slowly but surely trying to infiltrate those systems, take the language that the US has historically pushed forward, and make it their own. So while they undermine the laws and the rule of law, they undermine basic rights, they impose a massively repressive system at home, China in particular is also exporting the very tools they're using to clamp down on their own citizens. So it's no longer just about defending their ability to do what they want to do inside their own borders. It's also about the adventurism, their interest in exporting what they're trying to do and get other governments to do the same. So what does that lead to? Number 4, atrocities are the new norm. Here I find this really interesting, and there's a bit of a tension here. There's 2 sides. The first side is that you have governments like Hungary, which to me is one of the best examples of a democratic country gone completely awry, and frankly, the country I think President Trump would like to emulate if he could. You have governments attacking the press, denying people of their rights, running smear campaigns against activists, setting up parallel or alternative judicial systems so they can do what they want to do. But they're still covering it up, sort of. If you go to Hungary or you go to, I'm trying to think of another country that is really sort of Greece or Italy, you don't see blood in the streets. It's not quite like the Philippines, but is this steady erosion of the basic norms that we know to be true. But the abuse is constant. I met a woman from Hungary recently. She runs the Helsinki Commission there, and to hear her talk of how she had been smeared in the media and smeared in the press made her absolutely terrified to go outside, because she's afraid that if the government doesn't come after her, it's going to be Hungarians who have been fed these lies and think she's doing something she's not. We see something similar happening here in the US. But then the flip side with abuse as the new norm is groups like ISIS, who have totally reversed the understanding of hiding abuse, and in fact have used the brutality to radicalize and recruit. They have made that the new norm, and they have shown it and used it to great effect to bring people in, to expand their power, and to hold on to territory. There's an argument now with the president saying they're totally gone and defeated, they own no territory, but I don't think they're defeated sufficiently for anybody to feel comfortable that they're not likely to come back at some point, perhaps in an even more brutal way. If you don't have governments and institutions that can push back against these outright atrocities, what do you do? How do you respond? The rules and the regulations and the access to information and the ability to express yourself are gone. What's the answer? Challenge number 5, the harmful roles of companies and technology. Here, I'm going to have to say that while I still am on Facebook, I have huge problems with the way Facebook is promoting misinformation, disinformation, and pretending that the internet exists over here. For a while it did. Maybe some of you remember Friendster or those early websites that you could join. They just existed over here. They didn't have any impact in the real world. What we're seeing time and time again is that they do. Not only has the social media space become really virulent and angry, it has enabled and encouraged horrifically discriminatory, anti-Semitic, brutal actions. You see so many of the shooters in this country posting messages and notes that you can finally look and see the pattern and see what they were going to do before they do it. But in the case of Burma or Myanmar, whichever you choose to call it, where there's been a horrific ethnic cleansing of a Muslim population, What we found when Facebook actually started to explore the pages by some of the generals is that the Burmese military, known for some of the most horrific brutality I've ever seen in my life, and I've seen a fair bit, is that they were using Facebook to promote brutality, to encourage hatred, and to create communities that thought the same. Facebook was so unaware that this was happening, in part because it was in a different language, but because they didn't have anybody watching. That's not acceptable given the number of people around the globe that are on Facebook and that are using Facebook to communicate and talk to each other. Twitter, I was pleased to see recently, said it would take down political ads, particularly those that were misinformational. But Facebook has not said it will do anything like that. That's just the social media space. You can also think a little bit about companies and what they're doing, and perhaps the best example here is China. There was a company called Thermo Fisher. Maybe some of you have heard of it. It is a DNA blood sequencing company based out of Massachusetts. They were selling their technology to the Chinese government that was using it to ostensibly provide health care for all in the western province of Xinjiang. Xinjiang is a mostly Muslim province where the Chinese for decades have been repressing the people and most recently decided the best way to cleanse them of their Muslim problem was to throw them into labor camps and surveil them to the point where it's basically a totalitarian state. In lining them up and trying to get people to get health care for all, they were using Thermo Fisher's DNA sequencing technology to identify individuals. When this was finally exposed, both in the New York Times and with a report that Human Rights Watch did, actually, Thermo Fisher never admitted it, but suddenly stopped selling their technology to China. But think about this as China continues to be kind of the great, I think of it like a great technological stomach with the number of people there and the needs that the country and the government have. Companies want to sell to China, but nobody has any idea what the information is being used for, how it's being used. And the thing is, it's not just China. We're seeing this with Israeli companies. We're seeing this with American companies. We're seeing this in technology that Saudi Arabia is buying. In fact, Saudi Arabia bought Israeli technology to surveil Saudi women. So this is another example where you need a global community. You need a basic roadmap for the private sector to actually know what it's doing. And they need rules of the road, and they don't have them. So we're building it as we're walking on it, at the same time that we're looking at the global community being separated and shattered as competitors as opposed to community members. I'll also put out there, just in case anyone's paying attention to hard national security challenges that we might be facing, North Korea has recently launched a number of bombs. The Iran deal is totally failing, even despite Trump's promise that once the US pulled out, hard sanctions would make them change their behavior. There's a terrorist problem of creeping and unsatisfactory understanding. The UK is in disarray. The EU is in shambles. The UN Security Council is frozen. African leaders are changing their constitutions to extend their constitutional terms, but doing so without violence. And next year's G20 meeting is supposed to be held in Saudi Arabia. Oh, and there's more refugees and internally displaced people than we have ever seen in the history of the world, and less countries willing to accept them and give them resettlement. It's a pretty picture, right? Things look good. So where do we go from here? I'm a baseline optimist. I am, actually. Justin knows this. I couldn't do this work if I didn't see small steps forward as an important indicator of where we can go as a people. I'm not a doomsday person. I see silver linings, and I think there is a possible better way forward right now. It's just that the debate is ongoing, and the debate is ongoing in two ways, in both structure and substance. So here I want to talk a little bit about the substance. Does the US remain the great hegemon of the world? Is the US the unilateral global power? Should we still be? Does it make sense if Trump stays, if Trump doesn't stay? What about how the US engages? Is military intervention the way to do it? Should global conflicts and challenges be solved primarily with military intervention if things get sticky? Should we think more about competition and trade? Should that be part of foreign policy? What about labor rights? What about women? Interests, values, both together, separate, combined, one after the other. These are really live and hot debates that people in Washington are having. I know they're not quite as relevant to the rest of the country, to people who aren't paying attention to the intricacies of policy in the way that those of us who live inside and suffer inside the Beltway are paying attention to them. But they're important when you think about the US being a global actor. The presidential campaign, which nothing is lost on me here, we have basically 1 year, is going to play out tremendously in this space. If Trump wins, but there's a Democratic Congress, possible, I think we may see an angry Trump start to act globally in different ways. Here's why. He has more freedom to do that. He is not constrained in the same way. And the separation of ostensibly co-equal branches of government means he's going to want a free space to play. We just saw this. You may remember seeing in the news that Trump picked up the phone and called Turkish President Erdogan and green-lighted what became a violently brutal operation in northeastern Syria. There is a really good argument to be made that he made that phone call just around the same time when the impeachment inquiry was happening, because it would cover the media and people might start paying attention to that. If you think about a new president, there's so many things a new president is going to have to deal with, both at home and abroad. And fixing things at home is going to be a critical part, but it doesn't mean you forget about what's happening overseas. But going back to the Obama foreign policy, don't take offense, Dan, in my mind is not what we should be doing. We need to think bigger, we need to think better. And the US's role globally has been shattered. And in the meanwhile, the world has changed. So the good news is that there's reason to go forward. We can't go back. I believe pretty seriously that the international institutions, the frameworks, the laws, the treaties, the norms, the standards, all the things I said don't have enough air in them right now, are important. They're being massively tested, but I do think that they can recover. If they don't, you end up having a Turkey or a Brazil or a Hungary running them. You have hospitals in a conflict zone as a free-for-all where they can get bombed with absolutely no accountability. You have no free press, you have no freedom of association, you have no free expression. You might have some of that here in the United States, but it won't be the standard by which the international community tries to move forward. And there's good reason to believe more democracy actually is good for individuals. Democracies bring historically security, stability, and more prosperity. It's pretty proven. Yes, we're in a tough place right now, but I think there's good reason to believe that it will work. But also look at what's happening around the globe. It's not just about governments anymore, it's also about people. Hong Kong, Lebanon, Iraq, the United States. Look at the people who have come out to mostly peacefully say, no, Chile, I don't want this anymore. I don't want your economic restrictions. I don't want these social injustices. I don't want you running my country. You're corrupt. You're not giving me what I want. You're not making me part of your government. They're in their 23rd week of protesting in Hong Kong, ostensibly over an extradition treaty with the Chinese, but actually it's about so much more. It's about the fundamental rights of the people of Hong Kong, who have experienced lots of rights as part of the UK and are moving towards a space where they'll have many more. Here in the US, Americans have been so engaged. I mean, I think, Jess, of when you came down to our house in Washington and we went, everybody marched. And the number of people, I remember getting out of the metro at the Women's March in Washington and sort of getting knocked on my heels, seeing how many people were out there, women and men and kids, to peacefully say, no, I don't want this kind of government. I don't want these kinds of actions. You could argue that it's working, since the midterm elections showed a massive change, not just more than 100 women, but women of different colors, from different places, from different communities, a much more dynamic fabric of what America looks like than what had historically been there. So I think the good news is we can breathe new life into the institutions and the architecture that is at our core. The question is how. So I want to give a couple of domestic and international examples very quickly. At the domestic level, Congress. Now, I am biased because I used to work in the Senate. But I also believe that Congress has a tremendously important role in standing up to what I have been calling the imperial presidency. They do this on domestic issues, but they're fraught. They're more divided. On foreign policy and national security, there's so much more Congress can do, and they're not doing it. Yes, they're very busy right now with the impeachment inquiry, and that's going to keep them busy. But that's not the only thing they can do. Here's 3 other options that Congress could move on that would change overall the president's authorities. It would rein them in as part of the check and the balance that they're supposed to be as a co-equal branch of government. Number 1, endless wars. You've probably seen a lot of news about the endless wars. The New York Times had a piece this past weekend about vets who were feeling frustrated that they had served for a war that they didn't see any end to. They said they were proud of their military service, but they didn't know where it was going, and they would like to see the US stop fighting in the same way that it has. I thought that was a pretty remarkable piece. So it's Congress that decides war. It's Congress that declares, not the president. So the War Powers Resolution, which some of you may remember from after 1973 in the Vietnam era, is very controversial. But there are efforts underway to start to reform this resolution and rein in the president so that he or she can no longer have a free-for-all when it comes to declaring war. This is hugely important because it can change how the US goes to war, when the US goes to war, and for how long. Arms sales. The president works with the defense industry to sell weapons all over the world. And in doing so, Congress has a role, but it is not an affirmative engagement role. This is another piece of legislation that if Congress were to reform, the president would be reined in. This would mean no more weapons to Saudi, which is killing lots of people in Yemen with US active support, but also to every and any other country that receives weapons from the United States and uses them to an ill end. This is not just a Saudi problem, although that's the most obvious. We see it in Egypt. We see it in Afghanistan. It is constant and often something that I have worked on in the last 15 years, trying to rein in US arms sales overseas. Last one is limiting presidential executive authorities so they can't be used in a discriminatory manner. This is super wonky. And I'm not going to go into all of the detailed ways in which the Emergency Powers Act can be reined in and changed. But the basic point is that the president has extraordinary authority to do things like the travel ban, the Muslim ban, and the asylum ban. By changing this emergency power legislation, Congress would be saying, you cannot be discriminatory. You need to check with us before you do things like that. We are a nation of immigrants, and we believe in continuing to move forward in that vein. The other piece is support for people. Like I mentioned, Hong Kong, Lebanon, Iraq, Chile, all over the world, we're seeing this. But this also means supporting Americans. This is something that the Open Society Foundation has just started doing, and which 6 weeks into my new job, I'm really excited to build on. It's basically starting a constituency fund. If you think about engaging Americans on governance issues, in general, the piece that never gets any attention is foreign policy. I was in Kansas last week with an amazing group of people of all ages talking about global exchange, peace building, human rights, war, national security. And it struck me, as it struck me each time I travel outside the Beltway, Americans do care about foreign policy. They do care about how the US is seen in the world, and they do want the US to do better. So by supporting these programs and this constituency building, not only is Open Society starting to build that group of people, but we're also saying now is a moment when Congress is actually paying attention to the people that listen to them more than they ever have. The point is to re-engage Americans and build political power around foreign policy issues, not just domestic ones like healthcare, which is a little easier to do because it relates directly to you. So if we get to the international level, I'll move very quickly through 3 points. Most importantly, this would require a new government, but it's in a sense a plan for the next administration if in a year there is actually a new administration. The first one is what I call a coalition of the willing, but I call it coalition of the willing cautiously because I don't want anyone to think I'm trying to get a bunch of countries together to go to war. If the US is no longer going to be the dominant global entity, global leader, they need to work with others. We've seen this happen in Geneva around the Human Rights Council, so it's a very small effort to get countries like the Netherlands or Liechtenstein or Iceland to lead coalitions on big global issues, to build strength in numbers, and then to get out and move an issue. Yes, this was a small initial effort, but we have seen over the last couple of years that there's interest in doing this. And here, frankly, it would be good for the US to join some of these coalitions because a little national humility is not a bad thing. We don't always have to lead. The second is more active support for diplomacy, the institutions and the mechanisms that support all of these issues that I've been talking about. There has been, for the last decade, a conversation in Washington about development, diplomacy, and defense. And everybody talks about defense getting lots of money, development and diplomacy not getting enough. Particularly, I won't put up that finger, particularly the diplomacy piece. We're at a moment now where the damage that Trump is doing to the State Department, to the Foreign Service, is so dramatic that a massive investment in diplomacy is going to be essential for the US to actually have a strong diplomatic corps. That's going to take some work, some coordination with Congress. So far, all of the Democratic candidates that I've seen have expressed interest, but it's tremendously important because it will be norm setting for the rest of the world to see that rebuilding. And then finally, supporting civil society and the media. The US has had programs that do that for years, but they haven't always been as robust or thoughtfully applied as they could be. In countries where it's difficult to do that, like Egypt and Ethiopia until recently, they kind of did it in an ad hoc way. But there's a new generation of people who are looking at ways to support different kinds of media, different kinds of civil society groups, so that if you're looking at a closed society, or if you don't have access to a certain country because of wacky funding restrictions, the US government can still find ways to do that. So George Soros was recently profiled in The Guardian. He wrote a bunch of essays, and he's been getting some attention again recently. He's 89 years old. And he recently noted the well-known Martin Luther King quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." This is a quote I think President Obama used. Many people use this. But Soros went on to say, in sort of a classically Soros way, "I don't believe that's true. I think you need to bend the arc." So that's my challenge to all of you and to everybody you see and talk to and spend time with, everybody you teach, your family members. Help me bend it. Thank you. Oh, there's one over there. Thanks.
Well, thank you for that intense tour of the landscape. I guess the first question I wanted to ask is sort of a Washington question, but also a really, I think, important one for all of us, and that is, at the end of the Obama administration, I think, well, let's say it was before the election, I think we would have said that there was something that hadn't been there 15 years earlier, and that was a consensus on the importance of international development. And we would have said as well that there was probably more agreement across the aisle on human rights than there had been at any time in our history. You and I, well, certainly me, you're younger, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, got to Washington when there was a guy named Jesse Helms who was still enormously powerful in the Senate, and he wasn't alone, and he thought American money should not go down foreign rat holes, and that human rights was not a worthy subject for promotion by the US government. What is under the lid now in terms of that consensus? So let's stipulate for the record that lots of congressmen and women are afraid of primary challenges, are afraid of being tweeted, are afraid of being subject to a kind of, I gotta find a word that's acceptable for families here. The kind of treatment that was just has been unimaginable in other parts of our history. But what is left there, and what would it take to, get back more or less to where we were?
They used to say that partisan differences stopped, right, at the
Right.
shore. And that once you went overseas, Democrats and Republicans would work together.
Yeah,
and
that
I
was
saw
always a lie.
It was kind of a lie, but kind of not. That's the thing. I think there are the human rights realm, sort of like working on Africa issues, has always been very bipartisan. And I have always really enjoyed that work because it's been a bit of a strategic challenge because it means I have to leave some stuff at the front door to work on other issues. And that's hard for me, but I've learned how to do it. So I can work with Senator Rubio on Egypt, even though I really don't agree with him in any way on immigration issues. I can work with Senator Graham on refugee issues, even though I really don't agree with him on anything else. So it's still there. I think we've hit the most polarized moment I've ever seen between Democrats and Republicans. And what I'm finding is the silos are getting more significant, and the bipartisan collaboration is getting smaller. I will say that I had to walk in. I've done a lot of work on Saudi over the last couple of years, since the Saudi-led conflict began in 2015. But even before that, when Obama went to Saudi Arabia at the end of his second term, I was sort of trying to figure out what kinds of things could President Obama ask of the Saudis that would actually bring some change. He's not going to change the system. He's not going to get them to do that. But what are the small things that Obama could do that would bring a better life for people in Saudi who are living in pretty repressive conditions? And I was thinking so small at that time because there wasn't a lot to do. But since 2015, the door has been open in terms of pushing for change. And it's been really interesting to see how Republicans have engaged a lot on the domestic issues: repression of women, the right to drive, torture in the prisons. But around Jamal Khashoggi's killing, there was this renewed interest from both sides of the aisle to stop selling arms to Saudi. Somehow it didn't matter that all of these children had been killed in Yemen for the 3 years prior. The killing of Jamal Khashoggi kind of woke them up and got their attention. And while that was frustrating to me, I said, fine, let's just be really practical and use the opportunity to stop the weapon sales. I walked into Senator Graham's office with 3 of Jamal Khashoggi's children the week after the Senate voted on Kavanaugh's Supreme Court confirmation. And that was maybe the most difficult moment of my career in Washington, because as a woman, I often have to walk into the Senate and sort of put on my armor and, bust around and pretend that I'm just as tough as everybody else and have no feelings and don't care about anything, except exactly what I'm going to do. And I walked into Graham's door and I sort of looked up and I was like, ooh, I feel really small right now. And then I looked in the hallway and I thought, maybe I'll let the kids go in, and I won't. I'll just wait outside for them. And then I looked back at these 3 children of Jamal Khashoggi who had just lost their father and had found out about it in the media and weren't sure what had happened to him. And they were trying to get their oldest brother out of Saudi. He was under a travel ban and the Saudis didn't want him to leave. And I took a deep breath and I put my armor back on and I said, let's go. We got to get in there. And so we went in and we had a great meeting, and Graham was really helpful. And he continues to be a champion of stopping the arms sales and also sanctioning Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, and basically the person who called for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and has basically been the architect of the war in Yemen. And so he's actually been a champion. But it's tough because he's alone. And there's only so many times as an advocate you can keep putting your armor on before you get shot down.
Well, let me ask another part of that question from a different angle, which is you have watched election after election. To what extent are the newer cohorts of congressmen and women representing, shall we say, the president's base, which I think we can stipulate is not huge on human rights?
They're interested in human rights when they apply to them, but they're not interested in the universality of human rights. It's not pie. Like if I give you more rights, I don't get less rights, right? They don't understand that. Everybody can have the same amount. That's sort of how it works. I mean, we're in an interesting moment. The Republicans are not really willing to let go of Trump on a whole bunch of issues. I mean, I'm sort of trying not to follow the impeachment proceedings that closely because it drives me crazy, and it's very frustrating and upsetting. But I have found on foreign policy issues that they are willing and able to go at him. We saw this on Saudi, where Trump would not let go of the crown prince, and a number of Republicans, led by Graham, were absolutely willing to push back and say, no, we need to stop this. And then they actually, many of them voted to stop the war, US support for the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen, which was kind of amazing. It was a bipartisan vote. But also on the most recent Turkish operation in Syria, the Republicans were also very, very, very angry about that, and they felt that the Kurds, a longtime ally of the US, but often thrown under the bus by a number of presidents, were being treated horrifically, and they were really worried about, depending on who it was, anything from an ethnic cleansing to a full-scale genocide. So they were willing to stand up. I don't see that, sorry?
Briefly.
Briefly. They've sat down again, because Trump has fixed it. But the point is that you can sort of start to see and build some momentum. I haven't seen it translate from the foreign policy arena to the domestic arena.
So you travel a lot, outside of the country as well. And one of the questions that really interests me is, what will it take to recoup our losses? And you know, if President Trump is reelected, then that's almost it's an unanswerable question, and probably not worth asking. But let's assume that there's a change of administration. In the Obama administration, we very much felt that we had a lot of work to do after the invasion of Iraq and Guantanamo and waterboarding black sites. It is really hard for me to wrap my mind around what the requirements will be the next time around. And of course, you know, you never step into the same stream twice. And in many cases, other countries have gone in a way that will make it, you know, very hard for us to regain the influence with them that we would like. But I'm curious as to what you think are the not the quid pro quos, but the sine qua non.
The quid pro quos?
Yes.
Secretary Clinton was an amazing choice for President Obama for a number of reasons, but in part because she could do that tour and build on those relationships she had and say, we're back, we're here. And I think there was a trust there globally. Domestically is another story, but globally there was a trust. I think now it depends on a couple of things. If Trump wins again, if we elect Trump to be president of the United States again, we're stepping into a new era. If he's defeated, I think the global community, because I do still believe in one, will say, okay, they made a giant mistake. He screwed up a lot of things. He made things worse. He was damaging. He undermined our alliances, jeopardized our collective security, aligned themselves with dictators, but they got it, and they voted him out. So it kind of depends what happens next year on November 3rd. But then it also depends who it is that's in there, because I think in a lot of ways Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren kind of want to blow up the system too, and that's going to make allies, not in the same way Trump has done it, but that makes allies nervous too. I think Elizabeth Warren wants to keep NATO and support it. I'm not sure with Bernie. And I think some of those traditional alliances could be threatened, not in the same aggressive way, but they could be under threat in a different way if Bernie becomes president. So there's a lot of work the US has to do. I place a lot of emphasis on the American people right now doing a lot of that work. And I think it's not, I don't see foreign policy as a government-to-government thing anymore. It really is about people. Just before a new ambassador came to Washington about 18 months ago, I got a phone call from her chief of staff or political counsel or whatever they're called in the embassy. And she said, listen, our new ambassador's coming, and usually she presents her credentials. We present our credentials to the White House, and then we give a speech about, shared values, shared interests. We've always done it. It's kind of a stock speech. I said, yeah? Why are you calling me? And she said, well, we don't feel that we can give it this year. We don't feel that we can talk about shared interests and shared values when so much is at stake and the president has run roughshod over our alliance. And this is not a big country, but an important ally of the US. And I said, well, do you want to slam him in your public speech? Like, what do you want to do? And they said, no, but we don't really want to commend him for anything or talk about that. And so my response was, talk about the American people. Talk to the American people. Let them know that you are here, that you value them, that you want to engage with them, but you're not so thrilled about the government. You don't have to say a negative word about the Trump administration. Just talk to the American people. And she was like, oh, we could do that. So I think that's a lot of what I see being a critical part of regaining any place in the international community and regaining trust. Yes, the government's going to have to play a role, but the American people have to play a role too.
So I'm probably less of a baseline optimist than you are.
It's not hard.
And I would submit that one of the dominant concerns out there was the one voiced by Angela Merkel when she said, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, we just have to accept the fact that America is going through a period of instability when it's really not going to be picking up the phone.
Yeah.
And the thing is that as people with political preferences, you and I probably think that if we put a different person in the Oval Office, that will take care of our problems. But the rest of the world is still going to say, hey, what's to prevent this from happening again with that wacky electoral college and all the rest? And more to the point, there is an opposition to this new sainted president that has been created, that is energized, that is going to really cause a lot of problems. I mean, Americans complained about gridlock before. Just imagine what it's going to be like after. I'm one of those people who thinks that the Russians were meddling in our elections to ensure that when Hillary Clinton became president, that America was ungovernable.
You really are not a baseline optimist.
It's an ethnic thing. I don't know what else to say.
We're from the same ethnicity.
Yeah. But anyway, so I put that to you. Tell me why I'm wrong. Give me a reason to put the spring back in my step, to hug my dog and pat my wife and all the rest.
Well, I'm also a realist, I should say that. Like, I'm an optimist, but I'm a realist. This is not getting fixed, January 20th, 2021. Like, we have a lot of work to do. Trump is leaving behind, and then frankly, the Republicans are unfortunately leaving behind a legacy by not pushing back on him in the interest of the American people that is gonna take a long time to fix. Look at the decimation of the Foreign Service alone as an issue, right? I failed the Foreign Service test because I don't think like that. I think like spirals and crazy lines, but there are so many good people that have left. There are so few people, I'm sure you see this at Dartmouth, that want to enter the Foreign Service because they don't want to be branded as American with the current institutional architecture in place and if the current president remains. There is going to be so much work to do, and it's not just going to be up to a new president. I remember Obama sort of coming in and everyone thinking, he's going to fix it, he's here. And then I sort of sat there like, it's like turning the Titanic 5 seconds before you get to the iceberg. You're not going to get there. You got to do it earlier. You need a plan. The good news is the Democrats are all sitting around trying to figure out what it means to have progressive policy, what it means to be Democratic in New Hampshire, Montana, California, and even Mississippi. The good news is that outside donors are engaging and trying to support alternative centers of power so that you have Black and brown communities at a level of engagement where their voices resonate in a way where they just haven't, to push back on the institutionalized racism that has really plagued this country over centuries. So I think what we're seeing is a recognition that we all have to engage in the American project. My husband, who many of you know, likes to talk about how we all have an overdeveloped sense of rights and an underdeveloped sense of responsibility. It is also a phrase I used with my 10-year-old child last week.
And how did that work for you? Yeah.
Not well. Not well at all. He stormed out of the car. But I actually think it's true. We don't know what it means to participate in governance in a way that we're supposed to. I think that the founding fathers wanted us to. And I say that because I think what can give other governments hope is when they see Americans engaging in the project as well, because it says, look, they were really more screwed by this than we were, and they want to help bring it back. I will also just say that I was in Berlin about 3 weeks ago, and I have been trying to figure out why Berlin is not doing more. Like, come on, Angela, lead us. Like, you're the leader of the free world. Do it. Come on. And all of the German think tankers I met with were like, no, don't you know the German history? And I was like, well, yeah, I do, I'm Jewish, I do. And they're like, no, not that history. Well, that history, but also what came next, which is we want to work collectively in a community, part of a multilateral institution. We're not going to go it alone. We're not going to lead. And it was really interesting because the Germans are going through their own internal conversation because the younger German generation is sort of saying, hey, get up there. Like, this is our moment. Angela, you're it. And the rest of Germany is like, nope, too many problems here. And also we've got the AfD, which is the highly anti-Semitic party that has now gotten a very strong foothold across Germany. There's a great article that anyone who wants to read about Germany and sort of their own dramas I can recommend. But the point is that my expectation was that of course the Germans would step up, and Macron in France with all of his language. Well, but he can't get his government to do anything. He's got great rhetoric and not a lot of action. So it's not going to be fixed by any one government or any one person. It's about institutions, not individuals. So I go back to my point about breathing new air into the institutions and the frameworks that exist.
So you said something interesting a second ago, and this will be my last question, then I'll throw it up into the crowd, at least momentarily before taking the mic back. But about how Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren view the international system and what they would want to do. And the phrase that continues to ring in my ears is Elizabeth Warren saying in the debate, I'm pulling us out of the Middle East. Mm. And so I'm kind of curious where the human rights community is on this, because there's a lot up for grabs in the near future. And my guess is that there's going to be a big division in the human rights community between, robust engagement, which is a dirty business sometimes and requires dealing with actors that we really don't like, and others who will say it's the only way we make the world better, and dirty hands are a requirement of global leadership. So I'm kind of curious at your assessment of where this is all going to go.
This was like the 7-year argument that I used to have with my colleagues at Human Rights Watch. For most of my colleagues who work in or on the Middle East, Human Rights Watch had been kicked out of most countries in the Middle East. We were just banned, so we couldn't get there and not allowed to travel or live there. They saw the U.S. as a really nefarious actor, and that's what I meant. Like, they post 9/11, they only see the U.S. as a negative entity, a harmful actor who's making things worse, not better. But there's a flip side, and John McCain actually really represents a lot of this, and I think it's sort of the tortured side of the human rights community. On the one hand, John McCain was very pro-war. He did walk around singing "Bomb, bomb, 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 Iran," and that represented for people of the Middle East everything that was bad about the United States. At the same time, almost every single Middle Eastern human rights activist I would meet with asked me the way to John McCain's office on Capitol Hill. Because at the same time that they saw him as a complete and unnecessary interventionist, they also saw him as someone who really believed in individual voices and human rights defending. And I think it was sort of amazing to see how they would, from Libya to Egypt to Syria, it was crazy. It was like a parade of activists from the Middle East through his office, Russians, of course, as well. And so that question of, is the US going to pull out of the Middle East, is a real live one. The Open Society Foundation just started funding something called the Quincy Institute with the Koch brothers, which I'm sure you've seen, which is a very interesting PR campaign, if nothing else. But the point of the Quincy Institute, which is just getting up and running, is to look at US military intervention and encourage restraint. And I think that's really the piece of this question. I am not a peacenik. I do believe there are instances, personally, where the US should be intervening, but the way it has been done over the last 15 years has been manipulated, weaponized, and deeply problematic. Human rights promotion by the United States is very often seen as being done at the tip of the sword, and that has to change in order for the US to engage constructively. We aren't there yet. We, I think, are all starting to talk about what does restraint mean, how do we build up diplomacy, what does it mean to build relationships with universities in the region, or some of those people-to-people exchanges, so we better understand what's going on. I think Libya showed that the US had a terrible understanding of closed countries, and that you can't just go in from the air and get out without thinking about what happens next. So it's a pretty heated conversation with a lot of different answers, and I don't think it's going to result in one collective position. I think there's going to be debate and discussion endlessly about it.
Well, we could continue that, but right now, we give you all an opportunity. Please raise your hand, wait for the microphone, and make sure there's a question mark at the end of your question.
Sarah, thank you for coming up here today, and I read everything I could find about you online before I came up, because
Oh dear.
you're moving along fast and you've established some strong positions. I do want to say thank you for being absolutely naive as you are. And that's a person that served in Vietnam, saw us lied to by the Nixon administration, Nixon and his gang, by Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara. We saw ourselves deceived by Vice President Cheney and his administration. But at the same time, I wonder how a person like Lindsey Graham, that you've referred to a couple times, could change so much from the way he is now to what he was with John McCain living. I took the initiative, never think I'd get it done, but I called his daughter, who I thought delivered a terrific address at her father's service, to ask her, and I got through to her, and to ask her how she felt about the way. She said, I will never talk against him. She said, he is family. But at the same time, I think we hear it a lot, but I think we are coming up a truly defining moment in our history. For your 10-year-old child, for my 3 grandchildren, I really am concerned about this. And I'm concerned that if we find a way to get Trump out, if we don't find a way to get Trump out, maybe it truly is time, as we talked back in Vietnam, as a country to move to Canada, to move somewhere else. Because country's not going to be the same again. So if you're the optimist, I am the pessimist. The one last thing I want to say is, I've spent the last 4 weeks, weekends and as much during the week as I can, knocking on doors and making phone calls. I have a candidate. I'd like to see Joe Biden get elected. but much more than Joe Biden getting elected, I want to see Trump defeated. Could you react to what I've said? Well, let me just add one more thing, if I could, Sarah, and that is, I'm sorry, my 78-year-old
please.
mind's not what it used to be when a few years ago. And that is, I am really frightened, not by the reaction of people slamming the door in my face or slamming the telephone down, but I'm really concerned about the ill-informed people, whether it's Cornish, Plainfield, Claremont, or Charlestown, New Hampshire, that I've been going to, of them being ill-informed, but also not thinking Trump has done a bad job at all. Some much stronger than that. Could you react to a few of those things? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, let me be really clear, and thanks for and thanks for the work you're doing. I mean, I think that work to sort of get out there for whatever candidate is so important. I try in my work, even though I work at the Soros Foundation now, to be as nonpartisan as I can, which means I have to work with a lot of bad actors. It's been deeply, deeply upsetting to me to see where Lindsey Graham has moved in the aftermath of McCain's death. I work with him on far less things than I used to, but I am a practical person in the sense that I have a goal I need to get done, and in Washington you need to sort of put those strange bedfellows together and, as I said, put on your armor. So I don't like it, but I do it if I think it's going to move the ball forward. And sometimes it's ball forward, ball back, ball forward, ball back. But the point is that you've got to figure out when the moment is to work with some of those unsavory actors and keep at it. Facts and figures and research are not the sole way to get things done anymore. It's much more about telling stories and making a relationship that can create an opening for facts and figures, and that's harder than ever because people are so polarized and so divided. Look, I'm scared too. I was on sabbatical this summer, and my family and I went to Europe, and I took a news blackout, and it was pretty amazing. I didn't realize sort of how ground down I was. And I was talking to my mother at some point. She said, you know, most people do that. They take like a week-long news break, and they just don't pay attention anymore. They go out in their garden, or they do other things. They stop paying attention to the news. But I guess you can't do that. And I was like, no, Mom, I can't do that. My work requires that I pay attention to all of these details and all of these disturbing things, which is why the sabbatical was so useful. But we're at a really scary moment, and I think what Trump has exposed that is important for us to think about as society is the polarization, fragmentation, and deep inequality that exists and existed before him. He is not the symptom or the cause. He is not the symptom or the cause. He benefits from it. And so I go back to the question of how do we as communities, whether it's at the small level here in Hanover, whether it's in other New Hampshire communities, or whether it's at the national or the global level, how do we begin to fix these injustices, this polarization? What kind of commitments do we need to show people to make them feel like they're not being left behind, they're not going to be alienated, and that we are going to rebalance the system so they can have a fair share too? That isn't happening. I'm not convinced that that's going to happen in 4 years if we have a different president. But we do need to start looking at ways that that can happen. And that, to me, is part of what keeps me motivated, is thinking, all right, we can do better than this. We're kind of hitting rock bottom. But we all got to pitch in our own ways. And we all have to think constructively about how can we get this to a better place. So you can bet I'm getting on the road with my kids in the coming year, and we're going to be knocking on doors. You're all welcome to come down to DC and do it with us. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that the parties are changing. The Republican Party is kind of like two parties in one. And the ones that I used to work with when I was in the Senate seem increasingly gone. Those are people that I could work with. We had some fundamental differences, but they weren't shattering the system and running roughshod over people. There wasn't a policy of cruelty that was being implemented on a consistent basis. So I hear you, and I get it, but I got to do my job too.
Okay. How about right here?
Hi.
This is
I
my stepmother-in-law, for those of you who don't know.
We usually have a policy of not calling on family members. We're
Too
going to
late.
break that today.
Too late. I went to my first political event on Sunday, and it was a presentation of a group I had never heard of, but there were 15 Congress people, men, one woman, and 14 congressmen, who took the stage and talked about this caucus that they're all committed to, called the Problem Solvers. We sat a room of hundreds, I don't know how many hundreds, mostly undecided, but Republicans, Democrats, same with the Congress, these problem solvers who were there. There were 15 of 48 of them, and they're committed to working together. When they hash out an issue, they get 75% agreement on this. They vote as a bloc. I've never heard of them, but it gave me great hope. Is that a caucus? Have you ever heard of them? Is it something that I'm wondering why they're only 48, but they were pretty passionate, and it was very exciting to see that, at least in a small way, they're people from all walks of life, all kinds of experiences, who, even on the day of the impeachment vote, still kept their meeting because they had an important item that they themselves as a caucus had to meet on. So they demonstrated over and over again to this room was silent. We were all like, what? I wasn't the only one who'd never heard of them before, but have you?
I have not, but I do see people coming together in really interesting ways across the aisle. I think when it comes to Congress, there is, certainly in the Senate, there's this sort of weird feeling that even though we are on different sides of the aisle, we also are in it together. And I think it's a little different in the House. But they like to find things that they can come together on. The question for me with a group like that is, how much do they have to compromise to get to a common position or get to agreement? Because sometimes you see things get so watered down that it's not worth it. But I mean, I think what you're seeing are representatives who are tired of having everything blocked and want to be able to work together. They want to it's sort of like a figure eight. They've gone out, now they want to come back in. And it's exciting that you were able to be there and to hear it. And I think more like that is probably a good idea.
Let's go over here to the... Yeah, but we need the mic.
Okay. Welcome home, Sarah. I'm very impressed with how you wrapped up like the last 3 years so well there.
Thank you.
It's frightening. I lived in Russia in 1990, and I feel like you were describing what I was living, which is obviously very frightening. I'm wondering what you think about, if Trump loses, the peaceful transfer of power. That's something I worry about. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that. I'm sure. And by the way, I'm going home to my 13-year-old with the sense of responsibility, the underdeveloped. We'll see how that works.
It's a really good one. Oh gosh, peaceful transfer of power. I'd like to say it's not going to be a problem. That's sort of where I come out on top. But I think we have seen from the White House the president encourage and enable so much violence, so much discrimination. I think it was in the last month where there was sort of the whole conversation about civil war and the militia. So it is very, very, very frightening to me. Sort of being so close to Charlottesville, I followed that very closely. Actually, one of my friends was the guy who took the video of the car that ran over the woman, and his life got totally taken down by a lot of very violent, sort of libelous actors. And I think it's going to be peaceful, but I think it's going to be intense if we get there. That's the first part.
Right here. Right here. Okay.
Can you hear me too?
first.
Sorry.
You've already got the mic. You're next.
Thank you for coming.
So forgive me if I mischaracterize some of, and forgive me for coming in a couple minutes late, but it seems like the majority of the scope of what you talked about was sort of, where do we go from here in terms of how the United States is going to engage internationally post-Trump or just in the future, whether that's militarily or diplomatically, and then politically at home, what we're going to do with this. Because of your human rights background, I'm just curious if you could also speak to what we would do, what the United States could do when we're sort of reassessing and picking up the pieces, hopefully soon, legally in the human rights sphere. We might have this leadership posture on the global stage just by virtue of being big and rich and mighty, but we've not really shown that same level of engagement in terms of all the human rights instruments. We derogate from all the meaningful provisions. We never ratified the economic and cultural rights. We never signed the Treaty of Rome. We don't consent to the jurisdiction of the ICC. You get it. If we had new leadership and new administration, and we're doing all these other things, we never saw any movement on those issues under Obama, having thought, I burned political capital in other ways. I'm not going to get there.
Right.
Moving forward, seeing how much we do need to lead on the global stage, what do you see happening? What would be some ways that a new administration could actually make strides in those areas?
We, I think, are one of 3 governments that has not ratified the Convention on the Child. It's like us, Somalia, and Saudi or something like that. It's ridiculous. So that's a really big ask and requires, I think, the White House and the Senate to be democratic, right? So that's the first piece. You can't ratify a treaty with, and frankly, you can't even ratify, I don't think you'd be able to ratify a treaty with a Senate that was modestly democratic. You would need something of a margin, which if it does flip in the next election, I don't think it's gonna get, the margin isn't gonna be that big because I think a lot of the Democrats are gonna be pretty conservative. And those scary international treaties that are gonna come get you and take over your US law are not things that they're gonna wanna talk about. Incidentally, if you don't know, international law and human rights law in particular is often called unicorn law, which is sort of one of my favorite phrases as a non-lawyer because there's nothing to do about it really because the US hasn't turned them into national laws for the most part. So if you, let's say good news all around, you've got a Democrat in the White House, you've got a good majority in the Senate, and this becomes a priority. I think it's possible to see re-engagement on the Paris Agreement. I think it's possible to see re-engagement on the Rome Treaty, which is what underpins the International Criminal Court. The problem there is that you have a potential investigation into US soldiers in Afghanistan that, looking at their torture and abuse, which a lot of the a lot of lawmakers would not want to see, and then you have a potential investigation into Israel for abuse in Palestinian territories, which a lot of pro-Israel, in the traditional sense of pro-Israel lawmakers, do not want to support. So there's a lot of landmines there, but I do think you can at least get a better posture and support of the ICC, even if you can't get full ratification of the treaty. I think you could end up where the Obama administration was at the end of their time, which was in a great place. Not ratifying, but sharing information, working collaboratively, encouraging them, and frankly, even at one point, helping them take a war criminal out of Rwanda to The Hague. That was the US that did that. So I think you could at least see that kind of relationship, and that would be important because the court is in a tough spot right now, to put it mildly. Also, the prosecutor got a visa ban by the Trump administration, but that's another story. On the other ones, I don't think you're going to see ratification of the social, cultural, and economic rights. That kind of hits at the core of some of the issues that the US sees as rights, right? Like right to healthcare, right to education. That's not going to happen. That would be a very, very heated debate. I don't expect to see a lot of legal instruments turned around. I mean, the fact that we couldn't get the disabilities treaties ratified with Bob Dole on the Senate floor was sort of an astounding indication to me of where the US has gone in terms of its support for these international treaties. Come on. Domestic law still trumps international law, no pun intended, and it always will, and I think that's sort of where we are right now.
I wouldn't hold my breath for the law of the sea either, and that's only been waiting since 1981. So,
I worked on that one every year in the Senate. I
Yeah.
worked on that one. It
yeah,
never
no, I
moved.
think there's a lot of work to be done before the White House feels like it has the leisure to push for treaties.
Yeah.
So, questions? Yes.
Thank you again, for Sarah, for coming and presenting. You brought up Israel, and my question is regards that. Yesterday was the 24th anniversary of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, which led to kind of a sea change in terms of Israeli politics. If there were a rejuvenated American diplomacy, what might American foreign policy look like toward improving the situation in that neck of the woods?
Oh, this one's tough. This one's tough because we fight about it at my Thanksgiving table sometimes. But also
There's still time to Thanksgiving. I mean, you
maybe we
work
can
this
solve it
out.
and then I can go home for Thanksgiving. It'll be fixed. I mean, Netanyahu has made Israel, in my mind, is not moving in the right direction. Not just because of Bibi, but explicitly because Netanyahu has taken up some of that creeping authoritarianism, those tendencies that I was talking about, and really driven home the support for a vision of Israel that does not actually align with the demographics of Israel. At the same time, his comments about annexing and taking over the West Bank and continue to expand the settlements does nothing to help the ostensible two-state solution. I'm basically of the mind that the two-state solution, which would be really nice if it could happen, is all but dead. Like a lot of people have been talking about it's on life support. I don't even think it's there. I don't actually know what comes next. You have an occupation. There is law about how people need to be treated under occupation, and by all accounts, the Israeli government has violated those laws time and time again. So I don't know where we go from here, and in fact, many people are trying to figure out what frame can we think about in re-engaging U.S. policy to Israel, given the many landmines that exist within the Jewish community, within the younger generation, within the lawmakers, within the private sector, within concerns in multiple executive branches about leaving and letting go of the special U.S.-Israeli relationship. How does this get managed? And don't forget, there's millions of Palestinians who are either locked in an open-air box and have been denied their fundamental rights for a long time, many of whom are seen simply as terrorists simply because they're Palestinian. So we definitely need a better approach. We definitely need a more balanced approach. And actually, Open Society is just is supporting a task force run out of the Carnegie for International Peace in Washington to take a look at this question. There's one or two more in Washington right now that are starting to say, what's next? Where do we go? What do we want to see the U.S. doing?
Do you want to address the issue of conditionality that you and I were just
Sure.
talking about?
So, I mean, there's one of the hot button issues right now in Washington is, well, there's two. One is BDS, which is divestment, probably relevant on this campus at some level. Should businesses and colleges and others divest? But also the question of aid conditionality. The U.S. sends $1.6 billion annually to Israel, totally unconditioned. It's part of the peace treaty that was signed in 1977, thank you. But there's a really good argument that actually that incentivizing money is no longer needed because Israel and Egypt would like to continue the peace on their own. They don't need the U.S. to continue paying them to do it. So one of the conversations that's been underway that the Jewish groups are all trying to figure out and that most of the Democratic candidates have supported is that Israel should no longer get unconditioned aid. If the Israelis violate U.S. law, which includes supporting security forces that are torturing Palestinian children, something Human Rights Watch had reported on, they shouldn't get a free pass just because they're Israel. That seems fair to me. That seems balanced. That is a massive uphill battle to fight. Lawmakers are not totally ready to do it. Some Democratic candidates are supporting it, and the Jewish groups are all over the map when it comes to supporting it, or not.
Well, one would expect no less. Okay, last question. There we go.
You mentioned the Quincy Institute. Another member of that, one of the founding members, is a guy named Andy Basevich, who is a Army veteran whose son was killed in Iraq. And one of the things that I remember him saying in one of his books was, well, over the years, so America has approximately 8% of the world's population, but controls or owns up to 70% of the financial assets in the world, the wealth of the world. And basically our foreign policy over the years has been designed to keep it that way. Now we have a president who says he wants to withdraw the military from a lot of places on the globe, but anytime anyone does something he doesn't like, he wages economic war with sanctions that basically starve people to death. And then I listened to your description of the ills of the world, and yet Wall Street seems to love it. And institutions like Dartmouth are being enriched. And anyone that owns a 401k is doing really well right now. And I'm wondering if you think that those things might have something to do with our next election.
Oh, yes. We talked a lot about people power, but we didn't talk about the role of money in elections. We didn't talk about the role of lobbyists in Washington. That's a whole other talk that would be really fascinating. I often feel like I'm one woman working on an issue, and I'm up against like 4 different lobby shops that have been hired by any number of nefarious governments, and I'm sort of trying to outrace them with facts and figures and stories, and we'll tell the staffers, don't let the lobbyists in, don't see them, please, they're horrible, they're corrupt. Yes, I think it has a tremendous amount to do. I think part of the reason that you're seeing defense sales up is because it benefits the defense industry. The argument that it benefits American jobs is not quite right. The argument that it lines the pockets of a lot of people working at the top echelons of the defense industry is quite right. So I think this overplay between, or this connection between policy, domestic as well as foreign, and the private sector and Wall Street is huge. I mean, I think that has been separated from policy decision-making for a long time. I've been really focused recently on trade and how do we engage in a conversation about trade as it's interlinked to foreign policy. Historically, they've been very separate, but if you want to talk about something that matters to Americans, the question of jobs and labor issues as it is impacted by trade agreements will obviously play a role in their thinking about foreign policy. So yes, I think it has a huge, huge place. There's been efforts to uncover a lot of that money. I think I'd love to see restrictions on money in elections, but I may not work for someone who feels the same way. I often wonder what would happen if nobody funded elections outside of, a couple $100,000 from the DCC. So yes, I absolutely think it's a huge piece of it. I don't have a ton more to say other than sort of there's dark money, not dark money. There's weak restrictions. There's way to get around the restrictions. And it's clear that if you have money, you can succeed. If you have money, you can influence. And if you have money, you can do a lot of nefarious things that include getting the president to do bad things.
Okay, well, we're already past the witching hour, I'm afraid. Before I thank our speaker, I just wanted to say that on Thursday, right in this very room at 4:30 p.m., I will be in conversation with Jake Sullivan, formerly Director of Policy Planning at the State Department and the top policy aide to Secretary Clinton when she ran for president, also former National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden. So
And
I
a
hope-
great guy.
an all-around great guy, which you all know because you've seen him here before, but I hope you'll come again. It'll be an interesting conversation about the utility and the merits of impeachment, foreign policy, and after Trump. So I hope you will join us for that. And in the meantime, I hope you will join me in thanking Sarah for a fabulous, if occasionally depressing, conversation.
Thank you.